So teaching listening and speaking skills, that's kind of what I do. And so this is the basic agenda. These are the topics that I will cover today. I should let you know that I'm not one of these people who reads everything from her slides. I like to give you a chance to read through what's there and then maybe add to it, discuss it. If there are any questions you have along the way or any comments, please use the chat box. What I would like to do is start with introduction. So you kind of know who I am. Let me know in the chat box, tell me who you are. Tell me where you're from. Tell me what you do. So I see some of my instructors are here. So I know I've got some adult ed teachers, some ESL teachers. Give us a little, tell us who you are so I know who my audience is. Oh, good. Lots of ESL instructors. Wonderful. I see some of our consortium partners are here. Nice to see you all. I'm guessing South Jersey is really beautiful today. So I have to tell you, those who are in Monmouth County, Ocean County, Cape May, Atlantic, I'm really jealous. I miss spending I miss spending Memorial Day at the shore. So a little background. Thank you all. Let me move forward. So a little background. So this workshop is really an extension of research that I conducted. My dissertation was on oral vocabulary instruction with beginner level ESL students. And what I noticed, because I've been working with adult English language learners for so long, I noticed there was not much research, not much information about them. And in the research I conducted, I observed 3 different teachers, 15 classroom observations. I saw 263 total instructional activities over 15 hours of instruction. Of those 263 activities, 170 or 65% of them were general activities to teach reading, to teach writing, and to teach grammar. Only 35% of those activities were oral vocabulary activities to teach listening and speaking. And listening and speaking are two of the most important skills that your students will get, because listening and speaking are really how most people are introduced to a language. So think about high school Spanish or high school French, or even Latin. If you're part of my generation, you had to learn Latin. You learn the listening and the speaking first, hola, que tal, bien, y tú, and you learn from that. Well, our students have some of the listening and speaking skills, but they're limited. So a little background. This is your adult English language learner audience. And I know we do not get a lot of 16-year-olds in our program. Most of our students are older, but they're all here for similar reasons. And you know why they're here. Think about the students that you work with. I had, in one of my classes, I had a rocket scientist. I mean, a real rocket scientist. And I was just floored by this, that someone who was so well educated and so smart just didn't have the language skills. She was retired and her job was grandma, but she still had all these skills. And even though I'd been teaching a long time, it really hit me. If you take anything away from this slide, it should be the very last bullet point, that adult learners come preloaded. And I think a lot of times, especially people new to the field of adult education, new to the field of adult ESL, forget that our adults have their lifetime of knowledge and experience and work and life that they bring with them. So maybe they don't have the language skills, but gee, they've got a lot of other skills. So we need to treat them with the respect that they deserve. They're adults, they're not children, they're not stupid. They just don't speak English. Think of the last time you traveled to a foreign country and didn't understand what people were saying. So one thing I distinguish when I do workshops is the difference between academic and non-academic. So academic adult learners are those who are studying English because they want to go to college, grad school. Their goal is to get a degree. Their goal is to get that degree, maybe to go back home and use it back to their home country. But they tend to be literate in their home country and for the most part in English. And there's a limited age range, 18 to 49. Non-academic learners are the students that I work with mostly in my program. They're not really here to get a degree. They're here because of any number of reasons. They need to have English to survive in this country. Maybe just survive, maybe survive and get a job. Maybe they want to study more, get a college degree, maybe get some training, maybe get a high school equivalency. But the programs that serve these people are programs like mine, where we do not focus on academic vocabulary, academic skills. Even our high school equivalency program, not really academic, it's more skills-based and content-based, okay? So let me start with best practices with adult English language learners. And adult English language learners are different from first language English learners, are different from K-12 learners. And I know a lot of the research for adult learners comes from K-12, but not everything is the same when it comes to actual learning and comprehension. Okay, so some of the best practices for adult English language learners for vocabulary. And so as we go through the workshop, think of yourself in your role as teacher or administrator, but also think of yourself as a learner, because the way you learn is probably also the way a lot of your students learn. So think of yourself as the teacher administrator, think of yourself as a student, and also think of your students. So anything you see in my workshops, I want you to look at the way I presented to you, but I want you to take it and think of how you can use this information with your own group of students, or if you're an administrator, with your own group of teachers. So I know that for myself, my husband's family is still mostly in Italy, and we've been married a long time, and we've visited his relatives many times. Yet I still get there and I have to pull out my little Italian notebook and practice the words, and I have to try and remember how to say them. And when I come across words I don't know, I write them down, or I click them in my phone, or I say to my husband, what the heck did he just say? I don't understand. So I've been in the shoes of my students in that sense. With adults, it's a good idea not to give them too many words. Also, focus on words that they'll need the most, the high frequency words. Encourage them. When I was on the PTA in my son's school, I had a couple of friends who were internationals, and they walked around, one in particular walked around with a notebook whenever she came across a word she didn't know, she wrote it down. And this is how she started to learn English. This is how she increased her vocabulary. The dictionary isn't the be all and end all. Let your students tell you how they understand the meaning of a word. And then you can let them know whether, yeah, they've got it right, or maybe they don't. Okay. The second page of best practices with adult ESL. So, you know, the more you hear something, the more you do something, the better you are at it. Okay, you don't get to be yo-yo ma by picking up a violin and playing it once or twice. There's a lot of practice. There's a lot of exposure that goes into becoming accomplished at something. And that's pretty much what we're trying to help our students do, is to become accomplished English language speakers. I will say in my program, we allow dictionaries, translators for maybe the first 2 weeks. Then we try to wean our students off of it to rely more on themselves and less on the technology or someone else who will provide an answer. We want them to kind of work a little more to get the meaning, because sometimes that sticks with them more. Some of our students, so we do have students who have limited literacy in their home language, their first language. So they don't have the metacognitive strategies that the those with more formal education have. So it's a good idea to introduce those strategies in your classes, in your lessons. The students who already have the strategies get reinforcement. The students who don't have those strategies learn them. So an example is you're reading a passage, or you hear someone say a word. I was doing a Best Plus test this morning, and the word was neighbor. And the student didn't understand what the word neighbor meant. So of course, in the test, I just said thank you and scored and moved on to the next question. In a class atmosphere, the metacognitive strategy then is, so what are we talking about? What from our conversation, what from the reading, what from the activity can hint at what the word means? And of course, there are different metacognitive strategies, but that's one of them that you can use. And Bromley's quote, yes, our adult learners have larger oral vocabularies than reading, but they benefit from hearing words before they see them. Because when they see the word and they try to sound it out, they might not get it correct. So when they actually hear the word, they don't always make that connection. Okay, so quick vocabulary review. And I mentioned something about my research. So oral vocabulary is the words we need for listening and speaking, not a reading activity, not a writing activity, not a grammar activity. Written vocabulary is the words for reading and writing, and probably grammar, because you have them right when they do grammar. Oral vocabulary activities are listening and then reacting to, or, okay. Speaking activities are you hear something and then you answer, or maybe you're shown a picture and you talk about it. Listening and speaking is the combination. Like a simple conversation is a listening and speaking activity. But there's nothing written. There are no written words around that, at least not that the students see. So listening is an active process. Don't let anyone tell you anything differently. Even when you're in your car and you've got the radio on, or you're on the phone talking to someone and the TV's in the background, you may think it's passive, but you're actually processing what you hear. So listening is active, and it's often two ways or one way. So you can be participating as a listener, or you can just be taking in the information and remembering it. Think about listening to a news broadcast. You hear it, maybe you yell at your TV screen like I do, maybe you just take in the information that you're getting. Okay. Listening is also culture-based, and it builds on knowledge you have and adds to your base of knowledge. Okay. So when you do listening activities with your students, these are, so the column on the right is what you should ask your students to do when they're listening. And you might start small. So the first time you do a listening activity, a listening only activity, it's listen for the words you understand, or listen for the words you recognize, or listen for words that are new to you. Listen for the main idea. What do you think this person is talking about? So I like to play weather reports for my students. I like to play short news reports for my students. News reports, because news reporters in this area don't really sound like they're from this area. I'm in northern New Jersey. They don't all sound like they're from northern New Jersey. They have almost, I don't know, Midwest accents. I'm not sure. They don't sound like they come from New York or Jersey City. So I had to lose my Jersey City accent when I became an ESL teacher. But there are different reasons you'll have your students do a listening activity. And this is just some of the reasons, some of what you'll want them to do. So, audience participation time. I am going to play, if I can get the technology to work, I'm going to play a short weather report. What I want you to do is listen to the weather report. You cannot write down anything. I will not write down anything. The purpose of this is to put you in your students' shoes. I want to see what your ear is like. You know, when you first start learning a language, you want to pick up an ear for it. People speaking at a normal speed can be difficult to distinguish one word from another. That's what this activity does. It helps to get your students accustomed to the pattern of language, the sound of English as it happens in real life. Okay, so let's see. Okay, fingers crossed that this works. I think, hold on. I think I have to stop sharing this and then, okay. Please let me know if you are not able to hear this, let me know.
Highs in the mid-80s. Wednesday night, mostly clear. Lows around 60. Thursday, mostly sunny. Highs in the upper 80s. Here are the 1 p.m. weather conditions at the John Glenn Columbus International Airport. Under fair skies, the temperature was 71 degrees and the relative humidity 33%. The wind east at 12 miles an hour. The barometric pressure was 30.27 inches and falling.
Okay. Okay, so I would not have had that screen up with my students. My students would have seen this. So you got the listening. So how did it feel just to listen? Tell me in the chat. How did it feel just to listen? There we go. Yeah, so Karen, I'm going to tell you, your students will hate you for doing this activity. They will go home and tell their families what a horrible, mean teacher they have for making them just listen, because they want to write down everything. The problem is they are so busy writing down what they're hearing that they're not really paying attention. And the point of an activity like this, the basic function of an activity like this is to encourage them to listen and to focus on what they're hearing. Yeah, it's not the greatest. You will find something better for them to listen to. You'll find a better weather forecast or a better sound bite for them to listen to. But the point is to get them to listen and block out everything else. When they're writing, I mean, look at yourselves now, you're all taking notes. You're half listening to what's going on because you're busy writing. Very frustrating. And the point of that is to keep them on their toes. You know, it's a little frustrating. It's a little distracting. It's difficult. You'll find a better listening, but you're getting them accustomed to the sounds and you're getting them accustomed to hearing voices that are not yours. As ESL teachers, we tend to slow our speech. We tend to speak or try to pronounce, to speak a little more clearly, because we know the audience of people we're working with. The purpose of a listening activity like this is to get them to listen, to hear what other people sound like. So tell me, so now I'm your teacher, you're my students. So tell me, what words did you hear that you understood? Were there any words you heard in this weather report that you understood? What words did you hear? Days of the week? Yes. Temperature? Good. Yeah, it was Ohio. I didn't ask it to tell me New Jersey. I know what the weather's like in Jersey. Were there any new words that you heard? Were there any words, anything you heard in the report that you did not know that were new to you? Okay, barometric, yeah. Relative humidity, yes, yes, yes. Okay, so what was the general message? What was this? So I would tell my students, you're going to listen to a weather report because I want them to get in the frame of mind of thinking of the words they know that have to do with weather. Your class, you decide. You can play the weather report. You can play the sound bite, not tell them what it's about, and then afterwards ask them, so what do you think it was about? So let's go to the activity. So here's the listening activity that goes, here's the activity that goes with this listening. So I show them a picture of all these different clothes. And the question is, you heard the weather report. What do you think I should wear? Based on the weather report, what should I wear? Tell me one article of clothing that I should wear. Should I wear my snow boots? My scarf? Should I wear? So summer clothes. So tell me, what's one article of summer clothes? My shorts. I don't know, the last one he said was for today. Sandals. Yeah, well, see, I would wear sandals every day of the year. Okay, so you get the idea. The purpose is to play an audio clip, and then instead of giving them words, you have them talk about what they learned. Show them the picture, ask them to tell you about the picture. So even if your audio clip is about ordering lunch, you might have pictures of different foods or pictures of different locations to buy lunch, and ask them to tell you what they understood. Use pictures instead of notes, instead of writing down words. Okay, so you're forcing them to use different skills. Okay, next activity is a listening and speaking activity. So first, a look at speaking and some of the factors in teaching speaking. Okay, so speaking is usually give and take, right? Unless you're like me and you yell at your TV. Speaking is give and take. And the factors in teaching, or the skills in teaching, in speaking, are a little different. And I know years ago when I was in teacher school, they taught us to do repetition drills and all different kinds of drills. And as good as they thought it was back then, drills can be difficult. So you need to find other ways to get your students to repeat, to use, to practice the words, the language, whatever they're learning. They need to have practice with it. But remember all the factors that go into speaking. It's a lot. I mean, just the intonation, rhythm, and stress. You've got word stress, you've got phrasal stress, you've got sentence stress. So there's a lot that goes into these. So speaking, right? Different kinds of speaking, monologues, dialogues, planned. You're standing online at the supermarket, you start up a conversation. So you want your students to be able to participate fully in society, and starting a conversation with a complete stranger about the weather we've been having is really a big part of our culture. So let's get to the speaking activity. So, all right, let's see. So I would, for my students, so listen carefully to the conversation. You will hear it only once. No writing, no note taking, no asking a classmate for help. Any questions you have, we'll save for after the hearing activity, and we'll have a conversation afterwards. So normally I would just have this up for students. So all right. Okay, let me know if you can hear this.
Dad!
Yeah, Mikey.
Sorry.
Can I have a really good snack?
I don't know. I think it's, what time is it? I think it's going on dinner.
It's 3:30.
3:30. We better wait.
Why, Dad?
Well, what kind of snack do you want?
Candy?
No, candy is out. Oh, how about some broccoli?
No.
Carrots?
No.
Well, what else can you suggest?
Candy.
No, I don't think. I think you better wait.
A sandwich? A spinach sandwich?
Spinach sandwich? Spinach sandwich? When did you start liking spinach?
Today.
Well, what about a small sandwich?
Okay.
Okay, I'll whip it up in a minute. Play with your toys while you're waiting for it.
Okay, so let me quickly show you what the website looks like because I want you to see it. So one of the things I like about this website is that it has a large variety of topics that come in different levels: easy, intermediate, advanced. They give you the topic. They give you vocabulary to pre-teach if that's what you decide to do. Here, there are some idioms. you're given the listening activity, then questions, and then some additional activities. So my new share. Okay, so my follow-up to this activity is I would not show students these questions. This is for me as the teacher. I don't want them to see the questions because I don't want them to read. I want them to listen. And I would just ask the question. So what time of day does this conversation take place? Yep. And let's use the chat. Yeah, afternoon. So this is another activity where you could introduce vocabulary before you do the activity, or simply tell the students it's a conversation between two people. Let them tell you what they heard. So who are the two people in this conversation? And I apologize for the sound being so loud. I didn't realize it was turned up so high. Yeah, father and child, probably father and son. And what words did you hear that you recognized? Candy, yeah. And broccoli. Who gives their kid broccoli as a snack? What words did you hear that were new? Spinach, candy, sandwiches, yep. Snack. And you know, snack seems like such a simple word. Snack may be one of those words that your students have not heard before. It might be a new word. So the next question, why doesn't the father give his son something to eat? So you would ask these questions. Don't show them the questions. The whole point is to engage your students in conversation, to get them to use their listening skills and to get them to talk about what they heard and what they understood. And you can even talk to your students about snacks. So this could turn into somewhat of a culture lesson. So, before dinner, kids are always asked, my granddaughter especially is always asking me for cookies before dinner. And, if mom's not looking, I'll give her a couple. But what kind of snacks do your students eat? What snacks are popular in their countries? Yes, ruin their appetites, but I'm grandma. It's my job to sugar them up. So, and what kind of snacks are popular here in the United States? And what about kids asking for snacks before dinner? Is this something that happens everywhere, or is it just, our kids? Okay, fruit is always a good snack. Okay. So audience participation again. Listening and speaking activity. So here's another activity. This time I'm going to tell you this activity has to do with exercise. So what do you know? So activate prior knowledge. What do you know about exercise? You are your students. What do you know about exercise? What words are coming into your head? What vocabulary? What images? Because you might have images of people running or swimming or playing different sports. You might not have the vocabulary. You might not know what it means. Pain. My bad knees, I can definitely relate to the pain. What is it you know about exercise? So let me play the audio. Let me find the audio. Sorry. Oh, here it is. Okay, it's hidden by my. Okay, I'm going to try not to get it too loud. So I invite you to listen.
Listentheminute.com. Exercise. Exercise is something most of us love to hate. A lot of us avoid it altogether. I do a lot of exercise, but not because I like it. I do it because it helps me stay slim and healthy. I always feel great after exercising, so there are good parts to it. The thing I hate most is getting ready. It's always difficult after a hard day's work to come home and then prepare for your exercises. I really don't want to do it when I'm getting changed. I hate the warm-up stretching. I also hate the first few minutes of a run, swim, or cycle. But then, once my lungs stop burning, I settle into a rhythm and things aren't so bad. Recently I bought an exercise bike. Sitting in my house cycling to loud music or watching TV is a great way to get some exercise.
Okay, so tell me about that listening that passage. What words did you hear that you knew? Yes, I hate to say this, but most of the listening websites I've found have British or Australian or New Zealand accents. I have not found a lot of them coming from the United States. So if you've got a few listening websites you like to use and they sound like us, no British accents, let me know. Okay, lungs, exercise, bike, love to hate, swimming, burning. Okay, how about new words? Any new words? Okay, person doesn't like lungs start burning. Sure, yeah. Slim warm-ups. Okay, burning means something different depending on the situation it's used. Okay. And the general message, what was the general message? I think, so I'm up here in North Jersey and I've got my Jersey City accent, and I was down in Cape May a couple of weeks ago and I was still in New Jersey, but the accent was very different. People from South Jersey sound a little more like they're from Philly. People from North Jersey sound a little more like they're from New York. I think it's important for our students to hear different English speaking accents. So whether it's English from another country or English from a different part of this country or this state, I think it's important for our students to hear different accents. I would like to show you the web page. Okay, so you see it's got the listening. It has a transcript of everything that was said. It has fill in the blanks. It has questions. It has conversation starters. It has quite a few different activities that you may want to use with your students or, come up with some of your own. Again, I would not show my students these questions because I want them to focus on what they heard, right? So I'm not going to show them the questions because the questions might tip them off as to what the answer is. With our HSE students, we tell them, read the question first, then read the passage and find your answer and move on. I want them to think about what they know, and I want them to add to that. So I would ask them questions, I'd engage them in conversation, and, if they want to take notes, I would try to discourage them at first. I know at some point they're always going to write things down because they feel they have to write down everything the teacher says or everything they hear. Your students, your class, your choice, you know what works best, but I do strongly encourage you to do listening activities with that's what they're doing. They're listening and maybe answering questions, but not writing anything down. We want to build up their listening skills as much as possible. And I always remember with listening and speaking, one of the people I did my observations with for my dissertation talked about the importance of speaking and pronunciation. At the time, there had been a big fire in Jersey City and a few people died. And one of the reasons people died was the person placing the call, the 911 operator, sent them to Grand Street when the actual fire was on Grant Street. So having your students understand and be able to speak clearly is a very important skill for them to have. So practicing listening and speaking, I think, is very important. And I kind of can't stress that enough. Okay, so quick activity notes for listening and speaking. Do simple listening activities, even if it's 5 minutes a day. And I would say don't start every class with it, because the students who really don't like doing the listening because it's too difficult, it takes them out of their comfort zone, will just come late. So you've got to put it different times during class, kind of catch them off guard. Encourage them to encourage them to listen in English, whether they're watching television, listening to the radio. You can also encourage your students, and I know it's more a reading activity, but if they're going to watch television in English, if it helps them, let them put on the closed captions. I know that's technically reading, but if it helps them make connections, let them, or encourage them to listen to the news on the radio. Okay. So the next activity is, where am I? Okay. So the next activity is actually a dictation. And yes, this is a writing activity, but now we're transitioning to the speaking part. So a dictation is a good activity because it lets you know where your students are. It lets you know the word sound connections that they make from the written word to what they're hearing. It tells you their spelling, what they hear. So a dictation is a good activity to give you an idea of where a student's strengths and weaknesses are. And there's a method for doing a dictation activity, and it's kind of the magic number of 3, or maybe not a magic number, or the number is 3. So the first time the students hear the sentence is when you say the sentence, but you're telling them, listen, just listen. The second time you repeat the sentence, now you're telling the students to write down what they hear. The third time you say the sentence is when you ask your students to review what they wrote. So part of it is spelling, part of it is hearing the connection they make between what they heard and what you said and their spelling. So a dictation is a good activity because it covers so many different skills, and it gives you a lot of insight into your students, what they're hearing and the connections they make. So it's a dictation. I wouldn't show my students the sentences, but a dictation might go like this for my students. And I tend to do this more with a beginning level student because I find I want to know more about what they're hearing. So here's our dictation. So take out a piece of paper and pencil, write your name at the top. Today is May 26th. Okay, number 1, listen first. Today is Friday. Okay, take out your pencils and write. Today is Friday. Okay, check your answer. Today is Friday. Okay, number 2. And that's how I do it. I do slow down. I do try to pronounce sounds because I want to know what sounds they're hearing when I say these words. So your choice after the dictation is, how do you know what they did? And you have several choices. So one is to collect the papers and you read everyone's sentences, and that tells you where their strengths and weaknesses are. So while you do these dictations, you're walking around the class, right? As teachers, we never really sit still. We're always moving to see what our students are doing, to make sure they're on task, to make sure they don't have any questions, to check on how they're doing. A second option is to write the sentences on the board and have your students check their own papers. And as they're checking the sentences they wrote, you're walking around to see whether what you wrote and what they wrote, the similarities and differences, their strengths and weaknesses. Another choice is to have your students switch papers with a classmate, and they'll, not necessarily for a score. This isn't a good grade, a bad grade. This isn't pass, fail. This for me is just to see what you're hearing, where your strengths and weaknesses are. And punctuation is important. So my second sentence is actually a question. Do my students know what kind of punctuation to use? Do they know when to capitalize? So are they using capital letters at the start of a sentence? Are they capitalizing New Jersey because it's a proper noun? What else am I learning about my students? So this is a nice activity to get an overall view of where your students are with making connections between what they hear and what they write, and what they understand. Okay. So the next activity, and yes, it's not really, it is a listening, but it isn't, is a read aloud. And reading is a very important skill for our students to have. So now that you've built up their listening skills and their speaking skills, let's move on to reading. And reading is mostly about comprehension. It's also about fluency, because students who have less vocabulary, have more limited skills in English, will probably read a lot slower than your students who are more advanced. If they don't have familiarity with the written word, when they see these words, they'll have difficulty reading through them, processing them, understanding what they're reading. So different reasons we learn. I mean, who doesn't love a good book, a good beach read? But another reason we have our students read out loud is to hear how they produce sounds, is for what some people call accent reduction. And that's the last activity. But different factors in reading. And there's a lot that goes into reading. It's not just pick up a book and read, pick up an article and read. There's a lot that goes into it. Okay. So here's the activity. It's a reading activity. And I've used a website called English Around the World. And I'm sorry, the topic is English Around the World. When you do a reading activity, like any lesson, you have choices. So whenever I do a reading activity, I like to introduce at least some of the vocabulary before I do the reading, because I find that sometimes students get so focused on the words they don't know, the words they don't understand, they can't focus on the rest of the passage. So I like to introduce vocabulary. I like to activate background knowledge by telling them what the topic is. And I like to give my students time to read silently. And I found this is very helpful. Again, the number 3, students should be introduced to a reading passage 3 ways. I always like to let my students read silently because I think that gives them time to read and process at their own rate. While they're reading silently, I ask them to circle or underline or otherwise mark any words that are new that they don't understand. This gives me insight into where they are and how I can help them get to the next level. So after students read the passage silently, and this is the passage, so I would ask them to read this. And of course, they're reading, I'm walking around. So tell me were there any words you didn't understand? What words did you not understand? At this point, I would probably write those words on the board. I would create a word list for them. So I take the words that we introduced, the vocabulary I introduced, and I would add their words to the board. So I would expand on their word list. And we would talk about what the words mean. We'd talk about how they're used in the passage. And then the next step is to have
So Carol, just to be mindful, we're like almost at the top of the hour in terms of how much you need to get, how much more you want to cover.
like 5-10 more minutes. 10 minutes. Okay, so the next thing I would do is I would read the passage aloud because I want my students to hear the sounds, the words. I want them to hear intonation. I want them to hear stress. I want them to hear that when I come to a period, I come to a full stop. I want them to hear the different fluctuations, although, you know, we're not wildly high and low when we speak. I want them to hear how it sounds. I want them to see the words and make the connections between what they see and what they hear and how I say it. So you have choices now. So what's the third way they get it? You can let students read individually out loud. You can let them read chorally as a group out loud, which can be hard if it's a big group. You get people starting at different times, so be careful with that. And then you can have them read in small groups or in pairs, read out loud in small groups or pairs. And I always like to do a discussion of the reading afterwards with my students. And question and answer, and the website that I got the activity from has a lot of nice activities that go with, just aside from the Q&A, there were a lot of activities that you can use in place. The last part is accent reduction or pronunciation. And I'd like to remind people, I'd like to remind you that the goal of pronunciation, the goal of accent reduction is not for your students to completely lose their accents. Think of Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sofia Vergara or even Joe Pesci without their accents. It takes away from the person they are. Their accents are part of who they are. Our accents are part of who we are. My Jersey City accent is my upbringing. It's who I am. But I need my students to understand what I'm saying. Your students need to be understood in day-to-day interactions with people who are not in their classroom, with people who are not in this field. So the pronunciation is important for them so that they can be understood by people outside of class, okay? Different ways to teach it, different ways to assess it. I like to do natural assessments, and by natural assessments, I mean when my students are speaking in class, whether they're reading aloud, whether they're talking to me in conversation, whether I overhear them in conversation with a classmate, I'm making mental notes of the sounds they're making, how they're making the sounds, and what I can do to make it better for them. You know, TH is one of these sounds that's really strange or particular to English. Not a lot of other languages use a TH sound. So this is something I will practice with my students. If the everyday interactions are not enough for you, you can use an accent inventory or a readability test. I will tell you, readability tests are more for determining the grade level of a passage you plan to use, but that can be useful when you're dealing with beginners as opposed to intermediate advanced levels. An accent inventory is nice to use as a diagnostic, but you use it one-on-one with a student. You don't use an accent inventory with a group. So this is an accent inventory, a diagnostic passage. And I will apologize ahead of time that some of these resources are very old, but the skills don't change. I still use this diagnostic passage from Prater and Robinette. I got this passage when I was in grad school a couple of years ago, that I'll admit to. And it's a good diagnostic passage because it's not too high a level. It's pretty much the sounds in English that are most commonly used. It'll give you an idea of where your students' strengths and weaknesses are. And although this, if you get the passage from the book, it will give you a specific formula for marking students and how they make sounds. I will be honest, when I have a student read this, I just circle the sounds they're having difficulty with. I try to keep it simple. And for me, that's enough. I just need to know the sounds they're having difficulty with. You might want to find one of those cutaway views that shows like a half a face and shows you point of articulation, and you can use those too if that's helpful in getting your students to produce sounds. Remember, pronunciation is something your students need to be mindful. So my daughter-in-law is Japanese and she has difficulty with the ul sound. So every so often I'll remind her it's lake, it's lake, you know, unless she's talking about the garden and she's cleaning up in the garden, I'll remind her. And that's something to be mindful of. Fluency versus comprehension. So is it more important for them to talk fast like we do, or is it more important for them to be understood? Whether and when you make corrections is your choice. There is no fast, hard rule for when to correct your students' pronunciation or how. So you can specifically have a period during class where you're saying, I want to focus on how you produce sounds, or you say to yourself, I'm going to focus on sound production. You decide when you're going to make them aware of sounds that they're not producing correctly. A couple of elements and activities. Students who come after the age of 13, 14 will be more entrenched in their home language. Therefore, they'll tend to keep their accent more than students who come when they're younger, 8, 9, 10 years old, will have a better chance of losing that home accent, that home country accent. And it's really up to them to decide whether they want to keep it or not. But there are different ways that you can help your students to practice sounds. Games are a great way. Someone mentioned Burlington English. I do not work for them. I do not get paid for them, but they have a really good pronunciation software. And I would strongly encourage you to use that with your students. If you have, DOL programs, thank you, DOL, for giving us Burlington English. That's a really fantastic resource for your students to practice pronunciation at home when no one's around, so their family doesn't have to hear them repeating sounds or repeating words or whatever sounds they're working on. So these are some of the resources I used. These are my references. So I am not selling anything, but I do strongly encourage you to visit the website that has the article that I wrote, because every time someone visits the article, it tells me where in the world you're from. And I get a real kick out of that. I'm not selling anything, but I'd like you to visit. I'd love for you to read my article. And that's it. This is my contact information. If you have any questions, or if if you have any questions, or you want a little more information, I definitely can help you. Just email me. Thank you for staying. Thank you for giving me the extra time past what we did. And thank you for coming.